Hi everybody, welcome to this short video that I produced, which is going to give you some feedback on the assessment that you sat in Sociology last week. Before I crack on with the video, I just want to take this opportunity to say how incredibly impressed Mrs. Higgins, Miss Cannell and I have been with your maturity, your positivity and your general willingness to embrace remote learning in sociology over the last 12 weeks. It's been really difficult, really challenging, really alien for all of us. So well done. Hopefully you'll be back in the classroom soon. I want to talk a little bit about the assessment that everybody sat last week. And I do want to say as well how impressed I was that over 90% of people submitted their assessment in full before the 4 p.m. deadline last Monday. So if you were one of those 90%, then incredibly well done, very impressed. So, first of all, the grade boundaries. The assessment was out of 50 marks, and you can see on the screen right now what the grade boundaries are. 90% for an A star, 80 for an A, 70 for a B, 60 for a C, half marks, 50% for a D, and 40% for an E. First, I want to start off with some general observations that I made while marking the mocks. These are kind of common mistakes or issues that affected a lot of the papers that I marked. First of all, I'd say the biggest issue was timing. Some people spent far too long on the two short answer questions at the beginning of the exam, which only carried 4 marks and 6 marks, and then completely ran out of time at the end of the mock and didn't write enough for the 20-mark methods in context essay or the research methods 10-marker at the end of the exam. I know there's a temptation on those short answer questions to write everything you know about that topic, but only 2 marks are available per bullet point, and so there really is no point in writing long paragraphs. Secondly, bullet point those short answer questions. I've mentioned this before, but that's so important. The exam board says that any answer under 10 marks is allowed to be written in bullet point form, and this makes it easier for you to organise your thoughts, but it also makes it easier for me or the examiner when it comes to marking. So I cannot stress this enough. Anything under 10 marks, bullet point, 10 marks or over, needs to be written in continuous prose. Those 10 markers, however, do not need an introduction, they do not need conclusion. Some people are writing 10 markers like their essays with an introduction, multiple paragraphs, a conclusion. Not necessary. All you've got to do is write 2 well-developed, peeled paragraphs. And I'm going to talk more about that in a little while. If you are given an item, you should use the item. The item is there for a reason. The item often has some clues or some hooks that the examiner wants you to think about, and often gives you some ideas about the kind of sociologists or the kind of perspectives or some concepts that might be relevant when you're answering the question. So I really can't stress enough, use the item. And this one is a specific point to question 4, which is the methods and context question. And one thing that Miss Cannell and Mrs. Higgins both said to me is that not enough students, when answering methods and context, kept linking every paragraph they were writing back to the context. Instead, a lot of students just started writing the general strengths and weaknesses of the research method. And that means you're not going to get in the top 3 mark bands. So I cannot stress enough, every paragraph should make an explicit link to the context. So let's go through the mock. Question number 1 was outline 2 cultural factors that may lead to pupils from some ethnic minority groups underachieving in education. Now this question was a bit of a 2-prong question because on one hand it identifies cultural factors, and on the other hand it asks you to link that to ethnic minority groups as opposed to maybe social class. And so there's quite a lot to think about for just 4 marks. Some people confused cultural factors with material factors. If you write anything about material deprivation, that is low family income, poor quality housing, poor diet, lack of material resource, lack of money to spend on school trips or equipment, unfortunately, if you write any of those points, then you got no credit. And that's because the question really was focusing on cultural factors. So what was I accepting? Well, the most common answer that most people gave was language. Language, we looked at Fernstein and obviously Basil Bernstein, while we were still in class before the lockdown started, and they talked about language skills, particularly the elaborated and the restricted code. And a lot of students made the link between ethnic minority groups being more likely to speak the restricted code at school, particularly if English isn't their first language at home. Restricted language skills often lead to underachievement in education on the part of the pupils who can't express themselves, perhaps in a class discussion or in an exam, or the parents who might have restricted code and therefore not feel comfortable coming to parents' evening, for example. Second point you could have had was low levels of cultural capital. Do you remember we talked about Pierre Bourdieu in class and how he talked about how some groups who have low levels of cultural capital miss out on those key cultural experiences like being able to play an instrument or having foreign holidays or going to the theatre or going to museums, those cultural experiences that you need in order to be successful to contextualise the kind of things that you learn in education. Number three, you could have had a point about how pupils from some ethnic minority groups might lack expertise about how education works. And what I mean by that is might lack understanding or might lack knowledge about how school admissions work, for example, or might not understand how the sixth form application process works or how GCSEs are structured and work. And often, again, those parents who have low cultural capital might also lack that expertise in education. Fourthly, anything about attitudes and values are accepted. For example, some groups might not value education as much as others. And finally, quite a lot of people wrote about family structure and how some ethnic minority groups, particularly Afro-Caribbean families, are often headed by a lone parent, a single mother, who might not be able to have the time to support children, for example, with homework because they're working long hours. Question number 2 was asking you to outline 3 reasons why there are social class differences in subject choice. This was a tricky question. It was a curveball. And I know that because obviously in class we learnt about gender differences in subject choice. And I think some of you might have thought I made a typo when I wrote this question. Some people simply wrote 3 perfectly good explanations, but they didn't refer to social class differences. They just referred to gender. And obviously those students unfortunately got no credit. What you had to do for this question, and it's a real question, it came up 2 years ago, was you had to think about the knowledge you have about gender differences in subject choice and apply them to social class differences. So what kind of subjects do middle class students pick compared to working class students pick at GCSE or perhaps in post-16 courses? Research shows that middle class students are more likely to pick A levels, more likely to go to university, whereas working class students might be more likely to choose practical subjects, BTEC qualifications or apprenticeships. So why might this be? Well, I was accepting answers that people wrote about, number 1, language skills again. Middle class students might be more comfortable choosing language-based GCSEs and A levels. For example, things such as English language, English literature, or modern foreign languages, French, Spanish, German, that have a large speaking and listening element. If you speak in English with elaborated code, you might be more comfortable or confident studying these kind of subjects. Number 2, material deprivation. Working class students might be put off choosing certain subjects if they perceive there being lots of added costs in that subject. So for example, if you're from a working class, low income background, you might be put off from studying a subject which has lots of high equipment costs, such as having to buy an expensive camera in photography, or maybe a perceived large number of trips, for example, exchange trips in modern foreign languages, or an extravagant field trip to Iceland in geography. Number 3, setting and streaming. As you guys know, working class students are more likely to be put in the bottom sets and streams, particularly in subjects such as maths, and this might cut those students off from accessing certain courses post-16. For example, if you're sitting the foundation tier GCSE paper, where the maximum grade you can get is a 4 or a 5, you can't go to sixth form and study a subject that needs a grade 6 in English. It's literally impossible if you're only sitting the lower paper. You can't access it. You could have talked about teacher labelling. Teachers are more likely to see middle class pupils as being close to that ideal pupil we've spoken about in class. And teachers are more likely to recommend BTECs or apprenticeships to working class students who they might not label positively and might underestimate their academic ability. And finally, careers. Students choose subjects that they perceive as complementing their career paths. And a lot of research shows that working class students choose more practical courses, which they feel will give them access to a career that they perceive is for them. And that might link to their parents and their parents' attitudes and their parents' experience of schools as well. Any of these points were fantastic. Question 3 was an analyse question. And as we've looked at in class, analyse questions refer you to find 2 hooks in the item. The question was about ways in which the education system might serve the needs of capitalism. So it was a question that was asking you to link together your knowledge of Marxism with education. Now, this was tough because, first of all, it's an analyse question, which is difficult. And secondly, this was a topic that we studied remotely after the lockdown had started. So I was aware of that while I was marking it. And also, I can't stress enough that when we do get back in the classroom, this is one of the topics that I'm going to be going back over with you once we've got some face-to-face contact time. So, how do we answer this question? Well, essentially, just like all 10 markers, it should be laid out as 2 well-developed, peeled paragraphs. No introduction, no conclusion required. First of all, P stands for point. But in an analyse question, your point must come from the item. You can't use your own knowledge. Each paragraph you write must start with a hook from item A. I was just reading through the paragraph and I found 4 what I thought was quite straightforward hooks that you could easily have developed into a point. So the item refers to the means of production. That's a Marxist key term we're all familiar with. Each new generation of workers. You could have made a nice point there about children being the new generation of workers. The alienating workplace, which you could link to the alienating school environment, or the proletariat not seeking to overthrow this unequal system, which links to that Marxist idea of a false class consciousness. Once you've got your hook, you need to explain it, unpack it. What does it mean? Obviously link it to the Marxist view of education, and that's when you can bring in all of your concepts, your names, your theories, your studies that you've revised. You've got to evaluate. Who would criticise your point and why? Who would argue that education is not a negative experience? How could you criticise some of those Marxist sociologists like Althusser, Bowles and Gintis, and Paul Willis? And finally, link your point back to the question. If you followed this structure twice, you're probably going to get quite a good mark. I imagine 7 or 8 out of 10 at least. So, next steps. Obviously, this video has not included question 4, methods and context, or question 5, which is about research methods. That's because your other sociology teacher is going to be making their own screencast, looking specifically at these 2 questions. In terms of the mock overall, I think that some people might want to rewrite any questions that you underachieved on. Perhaps you misread a question, perhaps you didn't give yourself enough time, or perhaps you didn't know enough of the content in order to do yourself justice. If you want to have a go at rewriting a question, no problem at all. Rewrite it, send it back to me, and I'll remark it for you. Alternatively, if you don't just want to do the mock again, you're more than welcome to go to the question bank on the Learning portal and have a go at doing some alternative education exam questions. Some people might want to focus the coming weeks on creating some really high quality revision resources in order to make sure that you know your content inside out. This might be mind maps, flashcards, whatever works for you, but it needs to focus on those key pieces of sociological research, your key sociologists and what they believe, their theories, and finally, making sure you know all of those key sociological concepts that we use in class. Finally, if you need any help, you know how to get in touch with me, or alternatively get in touch with Miss Cannell or Mrs. Higgins. I hope you found this video informative and useful, and I really hope to be able to see you soon back in the classroom. Thank you.